Hello everyone, welcome to another video tutorial on the Code Angle YouTube channel. In today's video, I'll be showing us how to make use of nested data objects inside of the data grid in Material UI. This data table is going to have functionalities such as filtering, sorting, paging, as well as exporting to CSV. Also, we'll be making use of the JSON Placeholder REST API in this tutorial. And before we get started with this tutorial, make sure you click on the like button as well as the subscribe button as a form of support to this channel. I'll greatly appreciate that. And with that, we can now get started with this tutorial. So the first thing we're going to do is to create a new React project, and to do that, all we have to do is to open our directory in the terminal and run the simple command, which is npm init react-app, and then the name of the application, which I'm going to call grid. It's going to take a little while for our app to install. Now that the React project has been created for us, what we'll do next is to cd into the grid project and then open it up inside of Visual Studio Code. So now that this is done, what I'm going to do next is to make sure we have Material UI installed as well as the Material UI data grid. So to do that, I'm going to head straight to the Material UI documentation, which we have right here. As you can see under the Getting Started section, we have the installation instruction for both the data grid as well as Material UI itself. They both depend on each other, so we need to install both packages. And also, I'll be dropping the link to this particular documentation in the description box so you can go through the documentation. So I'm going to grab this at MUI/material as well as the motion for React and styles. So I'm going to copy that and then paste it inside our terminal so all the packages get installed at once. So I'm going to press enter, and while the installation command is running, I'm going to head straight to the project on Visual Studio Code and then set up the component files. So what I'm going to do is to open up the SRC directory. I'm going to increase the size of this code editor, and then inside of the SRC directory, as we all know, we have some boilerplates in React. So in the app.js file, which is displayed on the browser. So I'm just going to clear off the header section, and then inside of the SRC folder, I'm going to create a new folder called components. And inside of the components folder, I'm going to create a new file which will show our table. So I'm going to call this file grid table.js, and then I'm going to run the arrafc command to generate a boilerplate and then press enter. So to display this particular component in the browser, I'm going to grab this grid table, which is the name of the component, and then import it inside of the app.js just like this, and then we need to import it as well for it to show. And with that, we can now save and then run the npm start command. Now let's head back to our terminal to run that command. Also, as you can see, the packages have been installed. We've installed the MUI material as well as the motion for React, and then for the style components, and as well as Material UI data grid. So you can also take note of the version, which is currently version 5.17.7. So anyways, I'm just going to run the installation command, which is npm start, and then wait for the code to compile. So as you can see, the page displays the grid table from our grid table file, which we have right here within this div. So it shows our file works properly. So the next step in this tutorial is to work with the nested data objects. So the nested data object we'll be working with is in a platform called JSON Placeholder. And on the JSON Placeholder website, if I scroll down to the bottom of the page, we have access to different APIs. And the one we'll be working with today is called the /users endpoints. It only has 10 set of data, as you can see here. So I'm going to click on users so that we can view the data. As you can see, the data is kind of nested. For the first set of objects, we can see we have a nested address as well as a nested phone number. So as well as a nested company object. So what we'll be doing later on in the tutorial is to find a way to access this particular object and then displaying their data in the table. So, but for now, what we want to do is to integrate this particular API into our React project. To do that, let's head straight to the Visual Studio Code, and within the Visual Studio Code, we'll be making use of fetch to display the data. Before we get started, I need to bring in two React hooks. So the first hook I'm going to bring in is the use states. So I'm going to type in use states, and then the next one is the use effects hook. So these hooks are inbuilt hooks in React. So what I'm going to do next is to make use of a setter and a getter, making use of the use state. So to do that, I'm going to create a variable called table data, and then the setter is going to be called set table data. And then we bring in the use state hook, which is going to be an empty array by default. So the next step is to call the use effects hook. So I'm going to say use effects, and then we'll make use of an arrow as well as a bracket, and then we return an empty bracket, which is like a sort of dependency injection. We're going to make use of fetch, which is an inbuilt way of getting data in JavaScript, data from a REST API. So the fetch is going to take in our URL, which is the REST API URL. So I'm going to head straight to the browser once more, and I'm going to grab everything right here and place it inside of the fetch. It's going to be in quotes, and then it should return a promise. So we need to make use of dot then. Yes, so I'm going to make use of dot then. And then what we need to do is to convert our data to JSON. So to do that, I'm going to say data, and then make use of the arrow, the fat arrow, and then say data.json. So what I'm going to do next is to log the data in the console, and to do that, I'm also going to make use of .then once more because a promise is still returned, and then once again it's going to be data, and then we can now say console.log data. So I'm going to save and then head straight to the browser. Right click on the browser, click on inspect, and then click on the console. And then we can see we have an array of objects which has a set of data which are 10 in number. So with this, we now have access to our data from the REST API. And with that, we can now begin the configuration for displaying this data in the data grid in Material UI. So quickly, I'm going to head straight to Visual Studio Code once more, and I'm going to import the data grid. So I'll type in import data grid from at MUI slash X slash data slash grid. So within the return, I'm going to remove this grid table, and then I'm going to make these divs and empty fragments. And within the empty fragments, I'm going to create a div before calling the data grid component. So I'm just going to create a div right here, and then this div is going to have a style, an inline style of height. I'm going to give the height probably 400, and then the width is going to be 100%. And next up, we can call the data grid. So we've been able to call the data grid. So to get the data to show in the data grid, we need to pass in the data coming from the REST API as props. And to do that, I'll need to call the setter right here and then pass in the data while logging to the console. So instead of logging the data to the console, I'm just going to pass in the data to the set table data. And with that, the table data now have access to the data coming from this REST API. Like for instance, if I decide to log this table data to the console, you see we can still have access to the data. So before we get this displaying on the data grid, we need to set the columns for the data. So the columns is going to be representing the heading which the data will be displayed in. So quickly, I'm going to create a variable called columns. So I'm going to say const columns, and then it's going to be in form of an array, and then the array is going to take in different objects which represents each header. So the first thing I want to do is to display just three data at first. The first one is going to be the ID, the email, as well as the username. And then to do that, I'm going to quickly head to the columns, and then open a bracket and then pass in the field. So the field has to correspond to the data I want to display. It has to be the same set of characters. The ID must be something like this for the ID. So I'm going to pass in the ID, and then I'm going to give it an header name. So the header name is going to be in uppercase. I'm going to call it ID. So the next thing I want to show is the username as well as the email. So I'm just going to duplicate this twice. So this is going to be, let me check, this is going to be username. So I'm just going to copy the username and then paste it inside of here. So I'm going to pass in username, and then the email is going to be the same. So I'm just going to grab the email, pass in the email, and then the header name is going to be capital letter E, and then we'll pass in the email. Then next up, we can also add the width to this particular object. So for instance, I can give this a width of the value of 300. We can do the same for the email as well. So I'm just going to grab that and then pass in 300, and with that we've set up the headers, and what we need to do next is to pass it as props to the data grid. So to do that, I'm just going to say, first of all, let me pass in the rows, which is going to be the data for the table we want to display. So I'm going to pass in the rows props, and then I'm going to say table data, and then I can now pass in the columns, and the columns is going to take in columns, which is the variable for the columns. So if I save, I believe the data should display on the table. So as you can see, we now have the data displaying on the table, all 10 of them. So because of the height we set, which is just 400, that's why everything is not showing. So what I'm going to do next is to try to access the nested data within the object. So I'm going to open the console once more, and then let's take a look at the data once more. So I'm going to expand the array, and then for the first one, what I want to show is the street. So if I open the address, you can see we have a street which is nested within the address key. So I want to show the streets as well as the company name for each of the data. So when you look at the way the data grid is set up, there is no, like, when you look at it at first glance, there's no easy way for you to probably map through the data and then pass it to the data grid as prop. So ideally, to do this, we'll have to make use of something called value getter attributes in the data grid. So this value getter attribute is going to be used within the columns. So how do we do that? So what I'm going to do is to create another object. So the first object I'm going to create is for the street name. So I'm going to type in field, and then as we've done before, I need to make sure that the name for the field we want to display is the same in the object, which is this street. So I'm just going to copy that, and then I'm going to paste it right here. So once we do that, we can now set the header name as we've done previously. So the header name is just going to be called street. Then we can also give it a width of 300. So this is now where the value getter comes into play. So I'm just going to bring this down a little bit, and here I'm going to call the value getter, and then I'm going to open a bracket. What I'm going to do next is to give it a variable called the table data we have right here, and then make use of the fat arrow. And to know what to do next, let's just console log the table data within the value getter to the console. So what I'm going to just say is console.log table data. So I'm going to remove this other console we have right here to make sure that we are getting the right data in the console, which is somewhere around line 20. So I'm going to save and then head straight to the browser and refresh the page entirely so the states in the console can be cleared. And as you can see, we have a different set of objects appearing in the console. So let me open this one we have right here, and as you can see, we have different sort of values, but what we really need is what's within the row. So when I open the row, you can see we can now access the streets by opening the row, the address, and then you can see the streets here. So all we need to do to access the data in this street is to remove the console, and then we can now say table data dot row dot address, which is what we have right here. Let me confirm: row address and then street, row address then street. And we can do the same for the company name. So what I'm going to do is to duplicate this, And then instead of streets, I'm going to have company name. I think the company is what we have right here. So I'm just going to say company. Instead of streets, I'm going to replace that with company. And then didn't spell company properly. And then for the other name, it's going to be company as well. And then the width is going to be 300. Table data dot row dot company. And then I believe finally we have dot name. So it's company row dot company dot name. So I'm just going to pass in the name instead of the streets. So I'm going to save, and then let's see if the data within the nested objects gets displayed on the table. As you can see, we now have the nested data on the table, and we can see the streets value as well as the company value displaying, which is cool. So the final thing we need to do next is to set the page size. I don't want the row per page to be 100. I want it, because we're dealing with a very small set of data, I just want to limit it to a difference of 5 so that we can make the pagination effective, and then later on we'll now add the exports. So quickly I head straight to the data grid, and within the data grid component I can pass in the props. So the first props I'm going to pass is for the page size. So I can just probably create a variable for that using the use state. So quickly I'm just going to say const page size, set page size, then make use of the use state, and the default value is going to be 5. So quickly we can now head straight to the data grid components, and within these components we can just pass in the page size. So I'm just going to say page size is equals to the page size, which is set above, which is 5 by default. We can now set the rows per page options. So I'm going to type in this particular attribute, which is rows per page options, which is going to be in form of an array. So I'm going to pass in the array. So the first one is going to be 5. Probably let's make the next one 10, and then 20. So we're dealing with a very small set of data, so let's just leave it at that. And finally, what we need to do is to pass in the page size. Anytime we want to change the size from probably 5 to 10, we need to pass in another props to make that effective. So I'm going to pass in something called on page size change. So on page size change is going to be equals to, and then we create a bracket, and then within this bracket we're going to make use of the fat arrow. So what I'm going to say is new page size is equals to, we're going to call the set page size and then pass in the new page size. So that allows us to change the different page size, and with that is going to work effectively. So I'm going to save, and then let's see this in action. So as you can see, the page size has changed from 100, which is default, to now have a default page size of 5. So if I click on 10, we're gonna see we now have 10 sets of data. If I set it to 5 back, it's going to be reduced to 5. So with that, the page sizing has been configured, and the last thing we need to do is to make sure our exports works properly. So the exports can be done in two ways. We can make use of something called grid toolbar or grid toolbar export. So the grid toolbar actually has an advanced form of filter, which quickly I'm going to show you. So what I'm going to do is to import the grid toolbar. So we have grid toolbar, and then we need to inject this within the props in the data grid. So I'm just gonna do that right here. So it's gonna take in something called components attribute. So within the component attributes, I'm just gonna say toolbar, and then I'm going to set it to the grid toolbar, which we have on top right here. So I'm going to save, and then I believe we should see the export from there. As you can see, the export is not showing. I think I understand why that is. This toolbar is supposed to be in uppercase, so I'm going to change the T to uppercase, and then I'm going to save once more, and then wait for the page to refresh. And as you can see, we now have the exports, which has advanced filter options, which you can see right here. You can pass in the value of the data you want to filter, and it's going to display only that particular value. And also the columns, you can adjust it. You can play around with this later on, probably when you create this project. But what I just want to show you is the export. So if I click on this export, it's going to ask us if we want to export this as CSV or we just want to print this out. So let's test out the download the CSV. So if I click on that, you can see the CSV gets downloaded. If I try to open it in my Excel software, you can see the data gets displayed, which is cool. So but in the case where you don't want this particular advanced filter options to show, you can just pass in the grid toolbar exports. So instead of just having grid toolbar, you're just gonna add exports here. So I'm just going to copy this, head straight to the props, and then paste it right there, and then save, head straight to the browser, wait for the page to refresh. And now you can see the advanced filter options all have disappeared, and you just only have the export showing. Just to test if this still works, if I click on the exports, we have the same options provided for us, which is download as CSV. Probably let's just play with that once more and then open it in the Excel software. And then as you can see, the data gets displayed for us, and you can manipulate it however you want. And with that, we're done for today's tutorial. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, please drop it in the comment section and I'll be sure to reply. Thank you very much for watching today's video, and I will see you again in the next one.